Senators spend hundreds, maybe even thousands of hours discussing bills and proposals which will impact our state.
They also spend time talking about national issues. Our Marlo Lundak explains why some say it's worth being part of the conversation, even if the impact won't be immediate or local.
Here's something that we think is important, and here's how we think it should be recognized.
Legislative bills are meant to become laws. And while legislative resolutions can have that same intent, Creighton University political science professor Rick Whitmer says resolutions are often symbolic.
You know, a lot of these are often touch on things like a sense of recognizing the accomplishments of someone, or we think something should happen, just sort of general overviews of the sense of the legislature.
Two of the many stances that senators in Nebraska have proposed supporting through resolutions this session are issues that have been discussed nationally for years. Things like Washington, D.C. becoming a state and implementing term limits for those in Congress.
Overall, there's a 68% approval of term limits. That's a supermajority. That's Americans in general. The will of the people is very important. There is a groundswell of support for this term limits, and I think that we need to listen to that.
But are topics like these, that will likely have no immediate impact on Nebraska, worth the time when there are so many bills for state senators to discuss? Professor Whitmer reminds us that governmental change is slow and incremental.
There are a lot of important things that the legislature can work on, right? Will these solve important problems in Nebraska today? Probably not. But again, we've got to start these discussions somewhere. If we think they're good policy issues, that signals that we're thinking about them.
He says conversations like these do matter, even if the impacts aren't immediately felt.
You know, it seems very symbolic, but symbolic politics matters in a lot of ways. And it's certainly something that the legislatures can and should do. So,
on your side in Omaha, Marlo Lundak, 6 News.